What's up everybody, it's Joe here with Joseph Blake Photography, and in this video we're going to be taking you through every spec that we have for the Canon R1, and I'm going to be comparing it against Canon's other flagship camera, the R5 Mark II, as well as the R3, as well as Sony and Nikon's flagship cameras. So last week we got the official announcement and release information for the Canon R1, and a handful of creators and YouTube review folks have had these cameras in their hands. I have watched all of their videos, I've gone through all of those reviews, and I have boiled it down to what I think is the theory of the case. And so what I wanted to do with this video is run you through those specs, as well as the specs for the R5 Mark II that was also announced last week, the R3 that we've had for a little while now, and the Sony A9 Mark III and the Nikon Z9, because these are all surprisingly comparable cameras. All right, so first things first, I'm gonna go ahead and throw up the specs on the board for the R1, and let's run through them now. We've got a 24 megapixel brand new full frame stack CMOS sensor with a readout speed that they say is very fast, but they're not telling us what the number is, but it is faster than the R3, and it's new and it's great. It has an ISO range of 100 to 102/400. So 102/400 is your top base ISO before you get into your expanded ranges. 100 is your bottom before you get into a reduced low. We have a 9400K, 9 million dot OLED EVF. This is a brand new EVF in this camera, and they claim that it is the best and the brightest that they've ever made. This camera does have a mechanical shutter, and it shoots at 12 frames per second with the mechanical shutter, and through the electronic shutter, it can shoot up to 40 frames per second. That's a key component that we're going to talk a bit about. There is no burst mode, there is no expanded mode. It's 40 frames per second continuous with the electronic shutter. Where this camera really shines, according to Canon and some of the folks who have started to review it, is its autofocus system. It adds their new AI chip, the Digic accelerator, to add these additional components to its AF system. It still has dual pixel autofocus, although it now has what they're calling cross type, which means that it can focus on contrast areas that are both vertical, horizontal, and cross type. Dual pixel AF, cross type AF brings over the People Priority AF system from the R3, though improved with this new accelerator chip, and adds, also with the accelerator chip, the new Action Priority mode, where it will be using machine learning algorithms to track subjects and items through crowded and or busy situations or environments. And you have specific types of items that you can follow, like people, vehicles, animals, and that sort of thing. And Action Priority also adds 3 sports, which I believe are volleyball, basketball, and baseball. On the video side of things, 6K, RAW in camera, up to 60p. The articulating screen is a 2.1 thousand pixel or 2.1 megapixel LCD screen, very angle like all the other Canons. And the R1 is coming with an Ethernet jack, the bigger batteries that you get with the bigger body. It's also coming with pre-shooting, full-size HDMI port, and dual CF Express B slots. Okay, so that's the flagship camera, right? That right there, right? This right here. This is what Canon says is their absolute top of the line camera, best ever, most expensive, all the things. Now let's compare it to the camera that was previously rumored to be the flagship that they said wasn't a flagship, the R3. And I'm gonna put the R3 over here, but all I'm gonna do for this is I'm just gonna put the stuff that's different, okay? So the R3 has almost everything over here, minus the new stuff. Doesn't have the Action Priority with the Digic accelerator. And instead of the 9700 1000 dot EVF, it has a 5700 dot EVF. 5700, that's gonna mess me up. It's got a 5.7 million dot EVF. Still has the 12 frames per second mechanical, but now down to 30 frames per second, so a 10 frame difference there. It has oddly enough, a 4.1 million dot screen. The screen is actually the same size, but it has twice as many pixels in it. The pixel density is twice as high. I do not understand that. And while it is also a 24 megapixel sensor, I just will say that the 24 megapixel sensor in the R1 is brand new and is much faster than the R3, but still 24 megapixels. So same resolution, same body style, but what you get over here is the better EVF, and you get the improved autofocus system with the improved sensor. Still get people priority over here, still get the bigger body, you still get eye control, although they claim it's improved with the R1. And the R3 came out originally with an MSRP of $5,900 or $6,000 US, whereas the R1 is at $6,300 US, although right now you can get the R3 for about $4,500 on sale. Okay, so that's the R3 versus the R1. There's not a lot here that's different. And I think that's gonna be really clear when we get to the R5. So let's throw that up on the screen. So the R5 coming with a 45 megapixel sensor, almost double the resolution, though Canon does say that it is not the same technology, it is not the same stacked style, super fast readout sensor as the R1, although it is faster than the R5 Mark I, and it is almost as fast as the R3. So very super fast, but just a little bit slower than the R3 and slower than the R1. But the R5 does come with that Digic accelerator chip. So you get a lot of those features in the R5 as well. So it has a base ISO of 100 to 51,200, so half the ISO range, which kind of makes sense considering the higher megapixels. 5.7 million dot EVF, so fewer dots. 12 frames per second mechanical, seems to be pretty common with Canon, and 30 frames per second with the electronic shutter. Although again, that feels super weird since I am right now shooting on an R6 Mark II that has 40 frames per second in the electronic shutter mode, so I don't know. And no additional burst modes on the R5. But where the R5 shines, in addition to being the higher megapixel, all the things, it has 8K raw shooting up to 60p. And it's coming with a bunch of the cinema features that were on the R5C. And it has the one CF Express B and the one SD slot. On the autofocus, just to mention, while it does inherit a lot of the features from the R1, it does have the Digic accelerator chip, it does come with people priority, it does come with action priority, it's still dual pixel autofocus 2, it does not have the cross type focus points like the R1, but it does have the eye control autofocus from the R3 as well. Yeah, it's confusing. But now let's talk about some cameras that aren't from Canon. Let's put the R1 against the Sony A9 Mark III. Now, the A9 is a smaller body. It's not the full chunky brick body of the R1 or R, but it does have an Ethernet port. It's got USB-C, it's got full HDMI, full-size HDMI. It doesn't come with the eye autofocus, but it has its own version of an AI chip to do a lot of these other things. It's still a 24 megapixel sensor, but, and here's the big but on the Sony, it is a global shutter, which means it doesn't need a mechanical shutter. It doesn't read the sensor like this, it just reads the sensor all at one time, which is huge. So we talk about the readout speed of the R1 versus the R3 versus the R5 and which one's faster and all. And the Sony one just says, you know what, it doesn't matter, I'm gonna read them all at the same time. And that is huge. And it's huge because you can see the specs. It has a 30 frame per second continuous shooting mode, but it has 120 frame per second burst mode, basically until you fill up the buffer. Now, one thing is it does have a lower ISO range, although honestly, I don't know if that's necessarily going to be apples to apples, and we're going to do some really close looks at raw files that we see out of the R1. Also, the Sony just isn't as much of a video focused shooter. There are other cameras in the Sony line that do that, whereas the R5 is like a little bit of everything, and the R1 and the R3 have a lot of those video features baked in. That's what Canon does a lot of. But you can shoot 4K 120 in the A9 III. So again, what I want to pinpoint here is that the R1 is supposed to be the granddaddy of photo shooters, but it's 40 frames per second, no burst. It's not a global shutter. The Sony is. I love Canon cameras, but I have to be honest, if you were comparing these two cameras together and you were just shooting stills and you needed the absolute best stills, the Sony might be the direction that you go. I don't know. Moving on to the Nikon Z9. Now here's an interesting one because the Nikon is bringing in that higher resolution sensor, but in the larger format body like the R1 and the R3, unlike the A9 III. But with the larger megapixel rate, you end up with a base ISO of 25, half that of the R5, and a fourth that of the R1, the same as the Sony. Lower resolution viewfinder than the R1 by quite a bit. I didn't mention the viewfinder on the A9 because it is also a 9.7 million dot screen. It goes up to 240 Hertz. But here again is where another brand is able to beat out the Canon. 20 frame per second continuous shooting, a little bit slower than the Canon. 30 frame per second burst in JPEG and 120 frame per second burst in JPEG at a lower 11 megapixel rating. Also, unlike the R1, but more like the R5, the Z9 can capture 8K RAW at 60p. Whereas again, the R1 is limited to 6K. It doesn't have a big enough sensor, but the Z9 does. And the Z9 to me feels like they tried to find the best of both worlds between an R1, R5 competitor, right? Just somewhere there in the middle. And the Nikon going for $5,500. Okay, so just to wrap up really quickly, think about these specs for a minute. Honestly, I think you have to throw out the R3 because it doesn't make any sense. If you were going to save some money and buy the R1 style larger body, but you don't want to spend $6,300 and you want to go down and you want to buy the R3 right now on sale, right? Why wouldn't you just buy the R5 and put a grip on it? If you were going to buy the R3 at full price or closer to full price if a sale wasn't available, it doesn't make any sense. You would just buy the R1. The R3 doesn't make any sense. Now, Canon has said that the R3 isn't going anywhere, both in the individual and that they're going to continue that line. So we may down the road see an R3 Mark II. But the space between the R3 and the R1 and the space between the R1 and the R5 Mark II is so infinitesimally small. I don't know. I don't know what you would do to differentiate those cameras, to be quite honest. So at this point, what that means is that for $2,000 more, you get the bigger, more rugged body in the R1. You get the faster electronic speed with the better readout, and you get the cross-type autofocusing with the action priority AF. But you get it with half the megapixels. Why would you do that? I'm asking, why would you do that? Get the grip for the R5, connect it to Ethernet if that's what you need. Is it the dual CF Express Bs? Okay, that makes sense. But honestly, it doesn't make sense when you compare it to its competitors, especially the Z9, the most recent entrance to this kind of tier from another company. And the A1 is a little older. I don't know. You tell me. When I reported on leaked specs on this camera a while back, the video resolution was slightly higher. There were burst modes that were much higher than this. The quality of the sensor was supposed to be huge. And for a while there, we were hearing that it was going to be 30 megapixels. If we got an R1 with 30 megapixels, with a 60 FPS burst, with 120 and 240 burst that had there were some limitations there, maybe that's still coming. Maybe a firmware up, I don't know. But if they didn't, they're getting destroyed in the press right now. And I think that either they need to really quickly figure that out and fix it, or I don't know, they're gonna be in some trouble when it comes to the R1. It's basically DOA at this point, when the R5 is right there. And you have the Z9 nipping at its heels. Again, I understand that the autofocus system in the R1 is amazing, both with the new chip and with the cross-type focusing system. But when you take in everything else, it just doesn't land right. There's something wrong. There's something weird happening here. Let me know down in the comments what you think this is, what you think is going on. But that's the comparison. Those are my thoughts. Thanks for watching. If you like stuff like this, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks, everybody.